Hi and welcome to Jessie James Beads. How are you today? I hope you've had a beautiful day and will continue to do so. If we haven't met before, let me introduce myself. My name is Jem Hawkes. I'm from the United Kingdom where I live and work with wire, jewellery and beads and all sorts of other things actually, but we won't go there today. So at this very moment I'm over on Jessie James Beads Winter Workshop. I'm teaching a gorgeous candy cane design as directed by our fearless leader Sarah, who made a special request for this for myself. I'm going to be joined over the coming weeks by 9 instructors taking you through a whole festival of winter inspired tutorials. If you fancy dipping your toe into a whole bunch of different jewellery media, then it's not too late, as every single one of those 10 classes and other get-togethers, there will be some partying going on, you just ask Sarah. They will all be available on Catch Up in the private group for Winter Workshop attendees. Have you even seen the huge tote that you get? Absolutely filled with glorious goodies. There is wire, there's a loom to do beading, there is Sculpey clay, there are exquisite, absolutely fabulous bead mixes, and it's jewellery making inspired by festive season throughout the ages. So it's not too late, there are still a couple of bags left to grab and you can catch up with those at your leisure in the special Facebook group. Meanwhile, today we are going to be playing with bead soup. Now, I love a bead soup design because you can let your imagination be dictated by something as simple popping your hand in a box of goodies. So what I want to do is just pop you down onto the board and show you the 2 different stashes of beads that I've got to play with, and also something that you can make with almost any beads from your collection. Just a little something to keep you going. I'll be back on my regularly scheduled Thursday 1 PM Eastern Time next week live, and I hope that you'll be able to join me then. But for now, let's have a look at those beads. So I've got the end section of my necklace crafted with beading wire. We have a gorgeous Jessie James Beads magnetic clasp at the back in a gunmetal colour, absolutely festooned with rhinestones. And then I've got a small rosary link on either side, which you can forego if you prefer. But what I'm going to show you how to do today is this little reference here down at the front. Now, if you're not familiar with the word Yule, it's quite an ancient word and it is a winter celebration based in Nordic and Scandinavian and Germanic histories. It actually stems from one of the original names for Odin, and Yule was a celebrated winter festival. So we still celebrate Yule in my household, so that's the word that I have chosen to represent in wire for you today. But I just wanted to show you what you can grab from your bead stash. Now, I've got my beautiful zipper from last year's Winter Workshop, which is where I am right now, and in this case I have got a whole bunch of sparkles. So why don't we just dive on in and see what there is. Oh my gosh, there's lots of sparkle in here. So why don't we just grab a handful and throw a few of those on the desk. I say throw, I mean place gently. So let's have a look at what a relaxed grab will net us. I seem to have got some of the larger sized beads. Obviously the smaller ones tend to float to the bottom. So because we're using beading thread through this section of the design, you can use really teeny tiny beads in your piece. So let's just pop those up towards the top for a second and take a look at my second collection of beads. This is a monster. It's in a big old box with ribbon that I've had for a couple of years, and it is full of fantastic Jessie James Beads beauties. Now I can immediately see a pair just in here that match. This is not pre-planned, this is literally a bead stash grab. So let's just grab a handful there and see what comes out. Oh, there's another one of those spangly tire beads as well. So you can use whatever colours you fancy. You can use drop beads You can add those on to the part with the beading wire if you like, or you can just use drilled beads as you prefer. That's beautiful. I think we might use that somehow along the way. Gosh, that's a stunner as well. That was from We Bead Pink. That's quite a recent addition. Listen to this. It's like walking on the most gorgeous beach. So let's pop this box out of the way. It's gargantuan and heavy. And let's have a look at the materials that we're going to use. I'm actually not going to show you the part of using your beading wire. I'm pretty sure you can operate crimps, crimp pliers and connectors and the such. So I don't want to bore you. My specialist area of work is the wire. So let's scooch those beads over to the side. You could do as I did with this piece if you prefer and be guided by finding pairs. I've been symmetrical where possible on this design. In fact, I think it's pretty much all symmetrical. So you can go for a grab and within that grab find pairs. There will undoubtedly be pairs in here or ones that will match in terms of colour. You can absolutely go for whatever you desire. Let the beads be your guide. So let's have a look at today's technique. Or just pop that up at the top. You can see that little bit there if you need to. So I've chosen to work in copper coloured wire for the reason that it looks better and clearer on my camera. I've cut around about 18 inches of 18 gauge wire. I try to keep it simple. It's more wire than you need, but it helps to have a contingency amount. A contingency amount of wire is just in case things go a little bit wrong. So 18 inches of 18 gauge. This is round. I'm using raw copper because it's soft and lovely and very, very friendly. If you work with a medium temper wire, the end result is going to be absolutely the same. So don't fret on that front at all. So of my 18 inches of wire, I'm going to start about 1.5 inches from one end and put a right angle bend in that wire. Let me just curl this end around gently. Don't want to do anything too stressful to the wire, otherwise you can harden and weaken it in one step. We don't want that, we want our wire to be useful. So I'm now going to grab my round nose pliers and create a loop into which I can connect to whatever I decide to connect to on the other end. And I'm just going to create a small circular form. Now, whether you're adding in another piece of 18 gauge wire, as I did here with this segment of rosary linked wire, or whether you're going to add directly in with some beading wire, it's entirely up to you how large you make that circular form. If you're going to use beading wire directly, as I've connected here, beading wire to a circular wire form, you can make that loop really quite tiny. So let's just give that a bit of a squish and a squeeze. Once I'm happy with the size and shape of that round form, I'm going to support the round form, not squashing where the wires cross over at all, and I'm just going to use my hand to start rotating that tail of wire around until I get at least sort of 3 or 4 rotations of wire down that main core. So once you get towards the end, if you've got very, very tough fingertips, you might be able to finish that off. For me, it's a little bit more comfortable if we grab a second pair of flat facing pliers. So these are straight chain nose and these are my bent chain nose. They are my favourite pliers in the world. And what we need to do is just to finish that little tail of wire away, just pushing it around until it sits flat. So what I'm doing is I'm rotating the flat facing pliers, the second pair around, in a circular motion in the same direction that that wire is ending. So if I switch the grip to a right hand grip, I will be able to better demonstrate for you. So it doesn't matter which pair of pliers you use for which side, it just needs to be comfortable. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate my pliers gently around that coil that we've made in the direction of the tail of wire until that last little bit sits down flat on the core. Now I'm not using a great deal of force here. What I want to do is to have a neat finish. Once it sits down immaculately into position, you can give that a very gentle squish if you wish to. So let me just turn that around and tighten up that coil by just popping my pliers in the loop at one end and on either side of the wire at the other end, and just very carefully, cautiously moving that, we can flatten that down and make it look super neat and tidy. Now, depending on whereabouts that wire has ended, that will decide which way is your front side. Now, because we're making a word, and I've chosen to make the word Yule, what we're going to do is choose the front side and use that as a guide in which direction we're going to start moving next. So this is the neater of the two sides, purely because the cut side is showing more on this surface. If I flip that over, it's slightly more hidden. And I'm just going to give that a bit of a smooth. We're working about a couple of inches at a time, so I'm going to warm a couple of inches of wire at a time. Now, if you have a large round form that you wish to use to help you get the first letter going, you absolutely can, but I'm going to show you now how you can use this freehand as well, and then I'll show you with a form on the next letter, just so that you can get a flavour for which one you'd rather use yourself. So that's now nice and toasty warm, and what I'm going to do is just use my finger to create a soft, beautiful arcing shape down at the base here. And I actually decided that I was going to define the start of my letter as the top of the coil, so the loop sits slightly above the letter itself. So let's come underneath that design now with those any flat facing pliers. So I'm going to just grip opposite the top of the loop and push that elongated tail of wire down and away. So it doesn't look much like the letter Y at this stage. What we want to do is make sure that we're happy with the shape and form that we've created. And then I'm going to grip further down away from that U-bend shape, and then very, very gently, small movements at a time, we're going to squish those two wires side by side. Now, the reason I say to go slowly and use small movements is that if you go very, very quickly, those two wires will twist and one will sit on top of the other. We actually want them to stay side by side. So teeny tiny movements, small amounts of pressure, and if you need to just flatten that down at any time, you absolutely can. Now, that's not completely closed up. Let's just dance the light over that. But you can continue until it is if you prefer, but you don't have to have it completely squished if you don't want to. Once you're happy with how the top of your letter Y looks, I'm going to give that a squish now. I'm really happy with that. So I am ever so slightly flattening that wire down. I'm giving it a fairly hearty squish, but I'm not crushing it. And I'm now going to just warm the next inch or so of wire, and I'll use my finger to just generate a nice smooth curvature down at the base here. If you struggle with that, you can grab yourself a marker pen or similar and just use that to guide the wire, the tail of wire, all the way around. I prefer to use by hand, but you absolutely can use tools like a marker pen, like a dowel, like something smaller or larger. So if you wanted to make this much grander, you might need slightly more than 18 inches of wire. And if you're going to make it much smaller, I decided that I actually would wear this as jewellery, but you don't have to. It's just a nice object to gift in and of itself. It's a multi-purpose when you get the hang of writing with wire. So let me just put the tool down, the tool which is a very old marker pen that I've had forever. And again, I'm just going to grip very, very firmly with my non-dominant hand whilst I just draw the wire over and warm that through. I want the next couple of inches at a time to be super fluid. It really does make all the difference to prepare your wire. Now, in my written Yule, I've decided to angle across the top of the letter Y and then start by angling up a small distance away from the backbone of the letter Y. So if I turn that firmly up, and keep that in the nice northerly direction. So the first side and the second side of my letter Y are at the 12 o'clock line, and I'm going to continue to use that as a reference throughout most of the lettering. Now the letter U is going to continue back down at the same height as the backbone of the letter Y. Just draw that slightly downwards, and again we have got that great big gap in the hairpin. So you can see that my wire is starting to lift up a bit. I definitely want to control that. Every time I make any kind of manoeuvre, I'm trying to keep this as flat as possible. So if you imagine this project between two panes of glass, the only place where that doesn't apply is the curls that we create around that core wire at the very beginning and again at the very, very end. So that is something to just be aware of. Just keep it under control. And again, we're going to practice the same technique we did right at the first backbone on the letter Y. We're now going to create the first side of the letter U. Now I'm going to squish in very small movements, and now, even having done writing with wire for a good 8 years, before I even started making jewellery with wire, I made decorations for friends to go on their festive trees with wire. Slightly improved since then, I must say, but that's what practice can do for you. So if you feel that the beginning of your letter U is not quite at the same height, isn't it lucky that we've got a little bit of flexibility and we can just lift that or push it down until it sits perfectly in line. I want to keep an imaginary line going across the top. Let's just borrow this for a second. You can have a piece of paper or a ruler. So I want to keep an imaginary line going over the top and try to keep it as even as possible, but you do have a little bit of flexibility with that lovely long languorous letter Y tail. So I'm going to give that a hearty squish because I'm quite happy with it. So I'm happy with how that's starting to form. What I want to do now is have a slightly softer curve down at the bottom, and I'm just going to pinch and move very, very small moments at a time. Now I want to recreate the dimension, if I possibly can, of the U that I have on the letter Y, if that makes sense. I do hope so. So I'm trying to keep them as similar as possible. So if you do choose to use a mandrel or similar, or a piece of doweling, then you can apply that in whatever location you need. So just again, being mindful to keep that as flat as possible, but I'm not squishing down anywhere wires cross over one another. So again, we're repeating a key technique of writing with wire. And I'm just going to push this all the way around and back down again. So we've got a bit of a U at the moment. We want to complete that. So again, I'm going to pinch the soft central section of the U and then the backbone of the U, and just draw those two pieces together just a little bit at a time until they sit. Now you can see exactly what happens if you go a little bit too quickly, or even if you're really concentrating, the wires will try to sit one on top of the other. Now that is attractive in wire writing, but it's not the technique I'm teaching today. I want to keep everything as flat as possible. So if you're gentle in your squishes, you will be able to just drop that back to its flat orientation. So again, I'm going to continue, just pinching a little bit at a time, until I get the backbone of the U into position. So we'll give that a bit of a squish and a squash. Keep that as flat as possible, like so. And then we're going to have a little bit of a kick coming out. Now you can do this by hand, or you can just pop those pliers in and see how that forms. So you can see how I've created it here above. There's a kick coming away before we go dramatically up and above the top line to create that letter L. So let's just try to keep a flat underneath and over the top, and just draw that up and around. So I'm trying to keep the spacing between the letters as similar as possible. So we've got negative space in here. I would try to keep the same amount of distance between them. Now you may notice that the backbone of my U is slightly lower. In order to keep that lowest section of the middle of the U exactly where it needs to be, what you can do is simply squish it up just a tiny amount, and you'll notice that the top of the backbone of the letter U just lifts enough for you to be able to keep that into position. Now you can, if you want to, follow a script. You can print something out from the internet if you desire, and you can follow that explicitly. But this is how I work with wire when I'm writing with wire. So I'm going to now bring that wire up in a straight line, trying to maintain the distance between the letters as similar as possible. So I can see I need to just tighten that up slightly. That looks a little bit closer to me. So let's give that a nice hearty harden up like so, before I decide how high I want to go. And if I'm wearing this as a choker, probably don't want to go too high, but it needs to definitely be higher here, otherwise you won't see what letter it is. So let's just push that wire over, and again I'm keeping everything as two-dimensional as possible. The only time I'm going for a third dimension is when I'm creating the coil at the beginning, and when any letters cross over as part of the necessity of the design. So let's keep this L shape in an absolute upright before we again return to that key technique. Very, very gently close those wires up closer together, and then I'm going to squish tiny bit by tiny bit, small amounts, making sure that everything stays flat, and just using the length of the flat side of those pliers to press that hairpin racetrack bend as close together as possible. Now it is of course possible to over tighten here, and if you do really crush this very hard, you can weaken the wire and it will simply break. So this is why I'm encouraging repeated small soft movements, and when you're happy we're going to squash it from above and below. So what I want to do now with my letter L, where we had the little kick from the backbone of the U shape, I want to try and repeat that into the next letter, which will be the letter E. So if you need to, you can grip up at the top, draw the wire over the top and then push it down. If your L is slightly baggy in the middle, as mine was, I've just fixed that, and you can see that those two lines are now side by side. So I'm going to try and recreate the backbone of the letter U, coming away like so. Let's have a look and see how that looks. You could write it out by hand first and copy it, but this is the technique that I'm teaching today. Let's give that a nice squish. Now if I pinch this very, very firmly, you can still draw the wire up, and you'll see that I've pulled that completely out of shape. So I'm encouraging using tools. So let's make sure that that's nice and straight. And then we're going to bring the wire up, maintaining that gap between the letters again, like so. And also referring to the baseline that goes underneath the curvy parts of the Y and the U, underneath the base of the letter L. So as we start to bring the gap between letters, again, refer to your gap, refer to your gap. This looks pretty decent to me. I'm going to start bringing the wire upright to begin with, and then I'm going to form my letter E. So it's around about halfway between the top of the U and the bottom of the U, and I'm going to do a very distinct right angle bend over to the right. So once I've set that right angle bend, I love doing the letter E in writing with wire, because you get to do something that's quite fun. So I've turned it on its head now, and I'm going to grip that right angle section that we just created. I'm going to push firmly up, but I'm not making a very sharp angle here. And let's just have a look at what that looks like. It doesn't look like much yet. It looks like it's all gone horribly wrong, but it hasn't. I really enjoy this next section. So what we're going to do is just grip a hold of this for a moment. Make sure this next piece of wire is incredibly smooth and warm. I'm supporting those bends that I've just made. The first one is a hard right angle, as hard as you need it to be at least. And the second one is quite soft. But what I do want to do is make sure that this next piece of wire is nice and warm, because you need it to perform the wire magic now. So I definitely want this to be coming out to the 3 o'clock position. It's a right angle bend we've created. Hold on to that right angle bend, take your warm wire and grab it by the length of tail and just pull. And you find this beautiful fluid letter E comes out of nowhere. We obviously haven't quite finished the end. What we do want to do is just make sure that the top of the letter E lines up neatly with the top of the letters Y and U. And if you do need to adjust that slightly, you can very, very gently just waggle that until it sits exactly where you want it to. Now we do want the pass of the tail of wire to just transect where we made that first right angle bend, just here. So that comes over the top of that angle we created. Let's just give that a bit of a flatten and then bring that tail of the letter E around, putting a little bit of extra heat into the next section. Grip that and draw it around. Now you can see that I'm doing this kind of waggling motion, and that really does help. So I want now to finish with another wrapped loop, and ideally I want it to sit equal and opposite to the first one. The reason, although the letter E would finish here, I'm bringing it up and around, and you can take it a little bit further away if it makes you happy. You can add a bit of an extra distance there because it's no longer part of the word. The reason I want it to hang at exactly the same height, so above the top of the letter E is where the loop will occur. The reason I want that to happen in this particular position is it means it will hang straight. So let's just grab a hold of that tail of wire at the imaginary line that goes over the top of the Y, the U and the E, and I'm just going to turn the wire away, making sure that that sits on that imaginary line that continues along. And then I'm going to grab my round nose pliers next and create that wrapped loop. I might just make a slightly firmer angle because it will be easier for me to grab with the round pliers if I do. So let's just rotate those around. Small movements again. Imagining, if you will, that you're going to get the exact same size that you started with. Let's just rotate that around. You can grab with those round nose pliers if you need to. Pop them back in and just take that tail across the back. And before I start wrapping around with that tail, I'm just going to pop this down. You could have 2 lines drawn on your board as well and use them to measure the distance between the top and the bottom of the main segment of your lettering. If that makes you happy, then go for that. What I'm going to do is just squish this flattened circular form, make sure that I'm happy with its position and its size, and then just wrap around with this last section of wire. Now, because I've got quite a long tail remaining, I've made a reasonably sized letter work. Overall it will be about 2 inches in length. That was using 18 inches of that 18 gauge wire. I've got quite a lot left over, and that's so that you have the option to add in these rosary linked segments if you want to. But what I want to do to make it easier to demonstrate is trim this to about 1.25 inches. And what I will do here is I'm going to cheat. I'm going to draw that away very gently from the designer. I'm not doing anything quickly or far too hard, just a nice gentle movement. Grip that circular form, and then I'm going to bring the tail around. And ideally what I want to do is replicate the same number of coils around this piece of wire as I did on the first side. So if you have 3 on the first one, you'll want to do 3 on the second one. But this one, I think we have a 4th visible wrap. So what I'm going to do is just take a look at the back for a second, trim that last teeny tiny section away, and then finish off with the exact same technique as we did before. So I'm going to find some flat facing pliers to hold on to the round form, and I'm being very careful not to squish anywhere that wires cross over. And I'm just going to tighten up this wrapping section to make sure that it sits down flat to that core wire. Now I've made that coil a little bit loose, which can happen sometimes if your wire is harder, you haven't particularly warmed it enough. So it does mean that there might be a tiny bit of wire showing on the front. Now you have one opportunity to fix this if that happens to you and it bothers you. So the first thing we're going to do is make sure that that's tightened up, and that the tail of wire is smooth and flush down to that surface. So what's happened is the tail, the very, very cut section, the last cut section, is now on the front. One time I can simply twist this around. So I'm going to support the tail and turn that once over. If you pull that trick more than one time, you will simply weaken the whole design and it will just fall apart at some point in the near future, and we don't want that. So you get one opportunity to fix that if it doesn't go quite to plan. Once I'm happy with how everything is sitting, and I just want to bring that slightly more up to true, I'm going to start by hardening up the loops. This will make sure that they keep their form. The next thing I want to do is harden up the beginning where everything is flat. Now I'm using my bent chain nose pliers. It would be smart if you have any old flat, these are kind of, I don't know what they're actually called, they're broad tip flat pliers. It makes life so much easier. I am not pressing down where wires cross over one another. You see, that's still free. What I'm doing is everywhere there's a flat section of wire, I'm going to give that what we lovingly refer to in my household as an om-nom. And an om-nom is just going nom 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 with the pliers to harden the wire. And this is actually a really important part of making wire writing that will last. So at the other end of the design, I'm going to give that a good hearty squish. I'm not pressing anywhere where the wires cross over. So where the wire is side by side, absolutely, you can give that a really good hearty squishle. That is definitely not a word, but not where the wires cross over. So squishy squish, squish squish. And if you practice on a word that you've seen, like this one, where it's been demonstrated motion by motion, letter by letter, you can then move on to making your own words. You can get wire to say whatever you want it to say. So I'm quite happy with how that has turned out. What can happen is you end up with a tiny bit of curvature, and that's just from how it is formed. So all you would need to do is be gentle and just flex those wires until it then sits flat. Now I have often created handmade cards with wire attachments. The cards are destined to be recycled in whatever way the recipient sees fit, but the wire writing is then a gift that lives forever with them. It can go on their festive tree, it can hang up in the house, it can go on their key rack, anywhere that you would want to have a word. I usually send a name, to be honest. So that is the Yule selection, or section rather, of the design. And I will just show you now how you can connect in with a bit of spare wire. So let's just grab the end of that spare wire, and again this is just the residue of that 18 gauge. Looks like we have just a little over 6 inches remaining, which means that we used around 12 inches or so in this word. And this word measures probably just under 2 inches from end to end. So that gives you some idea of the dimensions. I always say it's better to have too much than too little. So I'm going to show you how to rosary link on some extra beads. I'm just going to give that a quick warm through and then cut it in half, because we'll use just around about 3.5 or so inches on each side. Now I will just grab a couple of beads. Do I have any twins? I think I do have a couple of twins. There's those, and those look like twins. I think that might be the only ones. Hold on, there's another pair of twins. So I would make equal and opposite just to match. And you can see that that was a very large container of beads, which we just added a few handfuls from. So I'm going to start 1 inch from my end of scrap wire. Turn a right angle with whichever pair of pliers you prefer. Let's just clear this board down a bit for a second. That's better. Make a small round shape at one end, and I've made that into a spiral form, like so. And what we're going to do on this side, because I will add in later with beading wire, is squish that spiral down so that's flat, and then rotate that wire around one time. And I'm just going to leave that bit of wire sticking up. The reason for that will become apparent later. Then I'm going to add my chosen beads into position. You can choose whichever you want from your stash. That's the beauty of a bead stash project or a bead soup project. So I think that actually looks quite pretty, but you can choose whichever beads you fancy. If I was, in fact, I'm changing my mind already. Here we do have another pair, and they're much better suited. It's not perfectly symmetrical, but I like those colours together. It's quite a frosty inspired design. So what I'm going to do is now create a right angle bend on the opposite side, give myself a little bit of space between the bead and where I'm making that angle turn. You can see I've got slightly more than an inch at that end, and it will become apparent why I've left that sticky outy bit of wire in position. So what I would tend to do is make the second one at the same time, do kind of bit part work. So just create one and then get to this stage, add the other one, get to this stage, but I'll move those out of the way because you only need to see me make it once. And we're going to create a round form in the wire at the other end. Rotate that around and draw it across. And you can see again, when I create that round form, I create it as a spiral, so it's open. And the reason for that, let's just straighten that round form up. It's not terribly round at the moment, a bit more like an egg. And just get that nice and straight. What we're going to do is add that into one of our loops. So this is how you can create your own connectors, a little rosary linking, but with 3 beads rather than just one. I'm going to take the open tail, push that through the loop so that they are linked. It just spirals around so much more easily if you leave that gap. You can see the gap from there, and then push that back together by hand. So what we're going to do now is wrap around 1.5 times. And then we've got a little bit of spare wire on either end so that we can create the same number of wraps on those loops. So I think we'll probably be able to use all of the wire on this end. So let me just switch my grip, right dominant, can't train my brain to do it the other way. So you can obviously grip whichever way suits you best. And what we're going to do is take that tail of wire. Now I would normally say use the soft side, the curved side of your bead, of your bent chain nose pliers against the bead, because you're less likely to incur damage to it. However, it's quite difficult for you to see what's going on if I do that because my hand gets in the way. So let me just drop that down a tiny bit. We'll take that tail section of wire and just gently munch that away with those pliers, any flat facing pliers that have got a reasonably fine tip, until that sits neatly against the core. The core is the wire that goes through the middle. So we're then going to switch to the other end of the design. When I grip a piece that has already got wire connected to it, I need to grip across the loop shape of the item that I'm working with, which is the rosary link, and then I will not damage the loop that's on the item we're connecting to, which is the wording. So let's draw that tail around, trying to match where possible the number of rotations as I have on the far side. So I think I can go just a tiny bit further. Always being mindful of not smashing your beads, because that's a very sad day if you smash a bead. And I think I'll trim that to a very short amount indeed. Let's get that in the scrap pot for melting. I actually missed the scrap pot, but shh, don't tell anyone. We'll hold that loop now, again, not squashing anywhere that wires cross over. I'm just going from one side of the circular form to the other. And then we'll take that last tiny bit of wire and just give that a gentle little squeeze down so that it's nice and flat. You can then repeat on the other side if you so desire. If you don't fancy adding in rosary linking, you can simply add in directly to that loop with your chosen threading material. You can even put these directly into decorations to hang from the tree if you prefer. You could have 2 sections of ribbon, or you could have 2 pieces of ribbon that join above it. You've got lots of choices. Well, I hope you had as much fun with writing with wire as I have, and our beautiful bead soup projects. You can write anything you like in wire, but let's make it something friendly and fun, shall we? Thank you so much for hanging out. I'll be back on Thursday next week, 1 PM Eastern Time, with more live tutorials with Jessie James Beads and myself. I'm Jem Hawkes. It's my pleasure to hang out with you. Don't forget, if you do want to join us at Winter Workshop, you can get all of those classes on replay in the special Facebook group. If you haven't already signed up and you fancy joining in, drop me a quick direct message and I'll give you a little bit of a treat. Until next time. Bye.